jumped the gun. But the general to specific in the examples you're giving there, it depends to me on whether or not the terms have been fully defined. Because if mammals is not just a word, but is attached to a definition, and the definition underlying it happens to be, oh, it's, you know, animals in the clade, whatever, then they're equivalent. So
yeah.
it depends on,
Yeah,
defined.
I would draw a distinction between those types of general to specific indeed. That's part of my lengthy thread undertones, is for me, if it's not defined, it's not defined. It may be ambiguous. And yes, if you then append a definition, then yes, it's more specific.
I see what you're saying. It can be read that way, fair enough. Well, first I want to say, that's a contentious point. First, I just want to express general agreement that, yes, I think the everything in the main summary, these were big shifts in my position, and I think, yes, I did make the shifts you inferred. I'm still thinking it through. Unfortunately, I was hyper busy during that time, so I really want to mull it over again. But I think you've convinced me of, basically, we're dealing with the equivalence classes in the generic discussion, and there's a difference of treatment. I'm still thinking through what it means in terms of UX and everything, but I think you've bought me over, at least generally, about that. On the specific issue, you raise a good point about the clade versus all animals in the clade, but that would be easy to rephrase in the claim, right? I could say mammals give live birth, all animals in the clade Mammalia give live birth. I still maintain there is a way in which those can be construed to be the same thing and not a more specific claim. And maybe my example is not perfect in that sense, but there are such things as equivalent statements, like where it is not a narrowing. And
I'll preface it by saying the conclusion, or if you read everything, is I'm not ruling out pure equivalence.
Okay,
my whole argument here is about ruling out better phrasing of. I'm not arguing against equivalence.
Yeah,
interesting.
I see it as you have two different cases here, right? Again, you have the case where you actually have definitions attached to these things, and then their equivalence is whether or not the definitions are equivalent. And you have where there's no definition, and then you're just saying, is the language here talking about the same thing as the language in the other? And I don't know if you can say that, because I get the feeling that if you were to indicate they're equivalent, there would be a debate about whether or not they're equivalent, equal to whether or not people read the language the same way. So you're trying to say they're the same, and people would disagree exactly according to how they read the language, right?
Okay, I agree totally that saying that they're equivalent is a claim. It is contestable, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
I am not denying that. It's, for me, it's like narrower. What?
It is most definitely contestable, and the implications of that are, when do we consider it equivalent or not, are definitely user facing, and we can talk about them at some other point. One of the things that he simply wanted to argue for, we have to talk about equivalence and the impact of that, but that's even necessary before even starting to talk about better phrasing off, because better phrasing off implies equivalence. Fair
enough. So we can talk about equivalence first, and there's even the whole question of denotational and connotational equivalence, right? Do you have two definitions which may have the same, refer to the same entities, but not convey the same impression? And actually, the animals in the clade Mammalia is a very good example. Mammals is much more informal, and my point about animals.
No, it isn't. I did my reading, and it isn't. Mammals is as much defined within biology as.
Yeah. No, but here I replaced the clade Mammalia by animals in the clade Mammalia, so that it would be equivalent to mammals.
Yeah.
And I'm arguing they're exactly equivalent, but they don't convey the same impression. So this is really an example of.
But this is a great example, because if you disagree with the definition of mammals, so you can disagree with that equivalence. If for you mammals are not, that's the point here. Like,
Yeah.
why is the person saying all mammals give live birth? Probably because they have a different notion of mammals, or because they simply were wrong and they didn't realize this.
They didn't think of
And many
platypi.
things that,
Well,
yeah,
this example here could in fact be a distinguishing claim, right? You could take this exact example
Mhm.
and use it as a distinguishing claim for your definition. And then it's not debatable, right? It's my definition of mammals is
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
things that give life, right?
isn't it general to specific?
But that's a separate case. That's true, and I've made that point myself often. But that's a separate case. I'm saying, supposing we have agreement on the equivalence, which is a possibility, that mammals is just another name, like synonyms exist. If I'm replacing something by a synonym, and I think I can argue that there's agreement on the fact that animals in the clade Mammalia as a
Nicknames
synonym
of
to mammals.
people. We can, you know,
Yeah.
Tricky Dick or Richard
Yeah,
Nixon, I guess. Yeah.
that is also a good example, because the question of whether this is a better definition, of course, there's a rhetorical intent here. And one could argue that according to some criteria, a more neutral definition, a more neutral term is preferable. And in some other context, a more technical term is more preferable.
That's
because
exactly
it gets
what I
people to
highlight. Yeah, that better doesn't work for me in a base data, because it depends on these things. Better is highly contextual.
Yeah, but what that is absolutely true. But what I'm saying is, precisely for the point of how should I put it? Precisely for there's two things. One is equivalence is important so that you can carry over arguments. You can say anything I said about mammals applies to animals of the clade Mammalia and vice versa. And I shouldn't have, like, they're canonically the same. Again, presuming it's accepted, presuming that the equivalence is accepted, then I don't have to make the claims twice. And I think that's a useful function of the system, being able to carry over.
Yeah, but I see that being done through definitions, and like the way I see it is, again, going back to how I see a canonical claim as having a primary key, right? Once you have this primary key, which means things have all been defined and the structure is established, you have the liberty to represent it with lots of different language, right? Lots of different ways. You've anchored it now, and now you can say it in a simpler way. You can say it in the full, what is it?
It's moving the problem, because I mean, yeah, sure, you can model it like that. And if you're assuming that everyone agrees with the different phrasings, but the question is, where do these different phrasings come from? And that's where equivalence, as we're talking about now, comes from. If you first add animals, mammals give live birth as a first claim, and then later you add mammals give live birth with a definition, you're saying, well, you maybe remove the other one and you define it canonically and you add an alternative phrasing or something, or like, how do you get to the state you're envisioning?
The point I was trying to the point I was trying to make is precisely that you have said it's the same thing, but now you may prefer one phrasing or the other, and which one will you present to the user?
Can we skip the better part?
Okay, sure.
Because if you can agree that better, you can only agree that something is a better phrasing if first of all you agree they're equivalent. And right now we're even trying to distill how to get to equivalent.
Fair enough. Let's table better and let's focus on equivalent. I'm fine with that.
So I don't what is the, okay, yeah. So we're actually discussing whether or not there exists actual equivalence.
No, I think
the two are equivalent, right? So
I think we all agree, first of all, it definitely exists, and second of all, that it's needed. Otherwise, you don't have canonical arguments, you don't have reuse of. I think we all agree we want it, but we have different
Yes.
ways of thinking what that means for a system, and that's why we're talking about it. So you talk about
This is where I'm saying there's two ways you get there, right? Which is either somebody creates something from scratch with everything fully defined, which is a lot of work. Most people won't do that. Or
what is
you're
everything?
evolving it somehow from pre-existing things, right?
But what
you're
is
adding
everything fully
formulas.
defined?
Huh? What is
What do you mean
fully
by
defined?
everything is fully defined?
When we define the primary key, then fully defined for me will be all the elements of the primary key have been established. And to me, that right now in my head means the structure of the claim, the logical structure, and every element, every part of that structure has been given a definition. It could be an ambiguous definition. That's fine. I'm okay with that kind of ambiguity. But each of those points has been defined. Yes.
So you're implying here that definitions aren't recursive, then I presume.
They are recursive. Yes.
Okay, then what is fully defined?
They're recursive,
okay,
but
I get that point.
This is what I was saying a few 2 weeks ago. I think it's possible to have well-grounded recursivity, that is a cyclical recursivity, in the sense that not that there is a fundamental foundational language out of which we can define everything. I don't think that's realistic, but we can say that something is well-grounded if it's grounded is in less contentious terms. And we can have
less contentious already requires agreement. And if you're just creating something fully well-defined from the start, like let's assume the system is empty, that means you can.
Yeah, and that means it's not a monotonic measure, and it's not even a stable measure. You can say something is well-grounded because it's grounded on terms which are not.
Yeah, you're dropping out. I'm dropping out.
Tim?
Actually, it might be my computer's fault, but I don't know. But I actually think maybe I wouldn't require it to be fully defined below the first level of definition. I think I'd be okay with that, because if it's not, the question is, am I okay with ambiguity? And I am okay with ambiguity, right? I am okay with, the question is, where does that ambiguity get analyzed, get discussed, get debated? Where does it show up, and how do you resolve that? Is there a process for that, right?
I agree totally.
Yeah, and
and so there could be equivalence of classes. Maybe I'm okay with. Well, I'll have to think through it some more. Go ahead and talk.
Because you were walking through how you see this being fully defined. Now you're saying, what I was trying to get at is, fully defined, does it mean that all potential phrasings are also included, or where do you place the potential phrasings?
Yeah, because that's almost orthogonal. Like if we say, we start with the claim mammals give live birth, and then we define mammals as animals of the claim Mammalia. Does that mean that we have the phrasing animals of the claim Mammalia give live birth? I mean, that's kind of folding the definition into the phrasing is a separate process.
No,
or if the phrasing appeared independently, then going through connecting it with the original phrasing is it automated through the definition, and how I see that less well even.
The main thing I want to get at for you, Timothy, was to see that even if somebody adds it fully well defined, it doesn't sound like that resolves the multiple phrasings issue. You will still have other fully well defined things that will end up being equivalents, or not. That's a question to you. Like when somebody adds something fully well defined, does it mean, in the case of mammals give live birth, that they define both mammals give live birth and animals in the clade Mammalia? Is that fully well defined, or they can skip that part?
And I imagine that phrases would be added as a
So
second
you see
process.
equivalence modeled within the formalization of claims, in other words. Whereas
Well,
Martin and
yeah,
I would
except
be
that-
outside of, and we want to have multiple formalizations of claims and then draw equivalence clause between them. So that's maybe why we think differently.
When you say, sorry, Tim, when you say phrasings would be added, for me, the point is this is a claim, like by adding a phrasing, I'm making the claim that this is an equivalent phrasing, and I want to be able
Correct.
to contest that claim. And so
Yes.
this is why I'm thinking, first I have an equivalent phrasing, then I have an equivalence link, and then that equivalence link gets not doesn't.
The thing
get
is,
retrieved.
the phrasing is context dependent, right?
Of course.
And that's a problem that I would want to discuss. The thing is, like, within the context of the canonical debate, that's a context with which you could make an argument as to whether or not this is the best phrasing or that's the best phrasing, right? Within that context, but
no, absolutely true. I mean, when I said better, and sorry, Stephen, but it's I said very I said it is better because it forces it doesn't force, but it leads people towards using a more technical definition of the term and using the
But that's not desirable.
specialist frame.
That was also, you can read through the rest later, but that's definitely not desirable. Like being more explicit about everything doesn't get you anywhere in conversation. It just means that you're constantly defining every single word you say. If you take that to the extreme, that doesn't work.
that's why it needs to be incrementally. Let's say
Exactly.
formalization.
Oh, no,
Or bolded even that part.
Of course. There, I agree with you. No, but for me, what is the increment? If you start with mammals and then a specialist says, when we're talking about animals of the clade Mammalia, we happen to include the monotremes, and the monotremes lay eggs, yada yada yada, right? Because monotremes are part of the clade Mammalia. So when they make the argument, they're kind of bringing in the definition. They're bringing in the equivalence of, no, Stephen?
Well, I want to cut you short there because that's not the essence of incremental formalization. The essence of incremental formalization is that you formalize it when there's disagreement on what something means.
Yes.
So the use case that you keep saying, I'm going to formalize this before there's any disagreements, goes counter the whole point of incremental formalization.
What I'm saying up to a point is that sometimes it makes sense to, and by the way, for me, the renaming is not what I call formalization. Just because for me, formalization is more structural decomposition as opposed to just changing a word or linking a word to a definition. But that's up to a point moot. But renaming thing in this case is used to justify the relevance of an argument. Suppose we start with mammals don't give live birth. An expert comes, says, well, egg-laying monotremes are subclade of the clade Mammalia. This is relevant because we know that mammals is equivalent to the clade Mammalia. So he would almost have to.
But why? I mean, yeah, you can use more complicated words, but again, as I gave the example, why not just say a platypus does not give live birth and be done with it? Like, why? How is?
But no, this is a great example, actually. Let's get into it. If I say a platypus doesn't give live birth, right? There's an implied claim here, as Jamie would say, that, hey, platypus are mammals.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm, slightly pedantic zoologist, but why not? I could say egg-laying monotremes are a subclade of the clade Mammalia. And again, there's an implied claim that the clade Mammalia is equivalent to mammals. What I'm saying is, in either case, I'm bringing in implicit knowledge. In one case, an equivalence. In another case, a membership.
Not the problem here. Like, why is that not sufficient?
No,
Even if
okay.
you say a platypus does not live birth and a platypus is a mammal, you add two, or either a composite claim or two
That's
separate.
perfectly sufficient. You might do
But then-
that and it's perfectly fine. Or you might be
In-
pedantic and do it the other way. And then you need to make that equivalence explicit of mammals and
like-
claim.
It's arguing against the claim by bringing up stuff that it's not the most
Well-
relevant point to bring up. Yes, you can start introducing definitions for the sake of, but that's not what the discussion is about.
And let me try to what do you call it?
Broaden.
Term. My language is not good today. Encenar. Let me try to act through a debate like this, right? To maybe highlight some of the things, which is somebody says mammals don't give live birth, or mammals give live birth. All mammals give live birth, just so I don't have that confusion in my head. All mammals give live birth, right? And somebody says that's false, opposes by saying platypuses don't give live birth, right? Okay, and then somebody responds to that by saying, well, platypus isn't a mammal. Okay, so what
Now
you've got
you have
here,
Definition
Right.
differences of mammal, and that's
right?
why
So
Donald
so
Trump
now
is
how do you
something-
resolve that? Right. First of all, there's also another thing there, which is, platypus. You've got what could be converted into a syllogism, right? It's a multi-premise claim with implied premises, right? A platypus is a mammal, and a platypus
Timothy,
doesn't
before
give
you
life,
continue, I
right?
want to highlight something here. If
Mhm.
people bring up that argument, at that point, you need incremental formalization because there's a disagreement on what a mammal is.
That's what I'm saying. Yes, I'm agreeing. What I'm
I
doing
think
is
we're all agreeing
incrementally
here.
formalizing, right? Because that turns into an infinite regression. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. Right. Okay. Somebody's gonna say, wait. Okay. And the way I would see it is, maybe somebody first makes explicit the syllogism here, which is that a platypus is a mammal and platypus doesn't give live birth. Therefore, mammals don't give live birth. Okay. And then somebody attacks no, it is a mammal. And somebody says, well, okay, now I'm going to need to split this off into two debates. This is
Are platypi mammals? And
right. Well, no, I would split it off into two debates where at the top, where I would say mammals is defined by this thing where it's only things that give live birth, don't give live birth. And mammals as defined in this external definition of mammals includes platypuses, which is right. So now you've got two separate debates where one is true and the other is false.
Exactly.
no, that's absolutely true. But that is not the case I'm speaking about. Though it's correct. I mean, if we have competing definitions of mammalia, we have two debates, and we agree to disagree on the definition. Fine, that's a perfectly valid avenue. Here, I'm supposing the first person was ignorant, or didn't think of platypus or whatever, or doesn't know about them. Same thing. And then a zoologist contests the claim, but uses technical language because that's what specialists do. I'm saying the person, it's not that they were intending to formalize. It's not that they just used the vocabulary they're used to. And they said, well, monotremes are part of the clade Mammalia and are egg laying. And because that's just the way they speak.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, somebody's like, what does have to do with anything? Well, clade Mammalia is just another word for mammal, and that would come afterwards here as a time process.
It isn't another word for mammals. You keep saying that, but it isn't.
It is.
Mammalia and mammal are not equivalent. Mammalia is the class, and mammals are the animals in the class.
Correct. So fair enough, but okay. When I say monotremes are a subclade of the clade Mammalia, that's even better actually, because here the equivalence goes through identifying mammals as members of the clade Mammalia. So here the connection is not even is a definition which is not an equivalence, but it's still, the relevance requires a connector, an implicit claim, just like there was an implicit claim, platypus are mammals. And let's assume that this isn't contested and there's not two definitions of mammals at play. It was just ignorance. But I'm saying an argument can contain other vocabulary whose relevance is not obvious until the terms are explicitly related. That happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, yeah. And then it can lead or not to a different phrasing, or that phrasing may have been found elsewhere. You know, animals of the clade Mammalia give live birth. It may have been found elsewhere independently. And then we want to say, well, actually, this was already argued about. We already had this argument about monotremes, which lay eggs, are part of our subclade of the clade Mammalia. And that argument is equally relevant to the new phrasing as to the old phrasing. But
we want equivalence. I'm sure we want equivalence.
Yeah,
that's back to where we were, right?
Yeah. But I'm saying the use of different vocabulary may arise naturally from finding examples in the wild. We don't have to assume it comes from the formalization, the progressive formalization process.
Yeah, I think it can come from everywhere. I don't think that's the main problem with equivalence. I think the main problem with equivalence is exactly potential disagreement with equivalence. Like when do you show, when do you treat them as the same, and when do you share each addition to one to the other, etc.
Right. Yeah, and somebody could say
by difference in definitions. Yeah, for example, like
say by mammals, I don't. By mammals, I don't mean animal members of the clade Mammalia. Exactly. I mean some. This is this is where.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about that for a second.
That disagrees on that definition no longer automatically also doesn't agree with the equivalence. Like, correct. How do we even deal with this?
Correct.
Well, there's another, the word I was looking for is dramatization, right? But I went through another dramatization in my head now about that. You know, what if the person who said that was just ignorant about scientific, classification, and made that glib statement without understanding, right? So they say, no. And this is again a person that's saying it, and it's in a canonical location, so there is no owner of this, right? But it's, you can see this happening more in a contextual debate as opposed to the canonical one. But somebody in a canonical debate is going to propose something about which they don't understand, right? So it'll sit out there where they say mammals give live birth, and they'll be contested by what is essentially a more specific version of the claim, which is of the clade mammalian animals.
Not necessarily.
And that will be proven wrong.
No. I mean, if people at mammals give live birth, the quickest way to contest it is simply saying no, they don't. And the majority of people say no, they don't. No,
they'll like a real actual counter argument is the platypus is perfect. Like that's what people would say. So no, but platypuses don't. Now the person is wrong, simply because they didn't define mammals and they were thinking all mammals.
No, but my point was that by adding a more specific definition, you don't resolve the problem. If you add an equivalence from mammals give live birth to animals in the clade Mammalia give live birth, it's not even a counter argument.
Well, no, that's why you split it, right? You split it and say, well, okay, if we are to define mammals in this way, we can resolve the debate by saying that platypuses, which are a member of this clade,
yeah, but then
don't give live birth.
That the platypus stuff is already there.
Yeah, but the other one is still there, and it begs the question, well, what was your definition of mammals then?
Exactly.
Right, and I just kind of said, okay, we come up with some of the definitions, but really the person who created probably, there is no definition it's going to sit out there without a definition. It's going to sit there with the ambiguity and without the definition. But in a contextual sense, where you knew who the owner was, you go back to, well, what was your definition? Oh, it was, furry animals with furry warm-blooded animals. Okay, you got a definition. And now, you actually have separate definitions for mammal, and you could debate that separate one.
And that's why
separately.
you can
That's what they
disagree
do.
with definitions, by the way, which you definitely can. And that's another discussion we've had in the past.
Except that it's a different claim. The claim is this word should be used, or this definition should apply to this word, and this is the definition that should be used, right?
Okay, I have an interesting observation while talking about this, about equivalence and the result of people believing in equivalence or not. I'm more and more starting to think that given that equivalence can be disagreed with, whether or not you see claims on both sides of, like, suppose you add a supporting claim to an equivalence clause, whether or not you add that supporting claim to all or not will depend on whether you believe the equivalence is true or not. So if you explicitly disagree that they're equivalent, of course, you don't want your supporting claim to be added to all of the other ones in the equivalence clause. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, this is something I covered in the white paper, more or less, or at least soon after writing the white paper, which is because I envision a curation process, curators doing this. If we have a curation process, then we have somebody who makes that decision, right? And the curator is going to be like, oh, I'm going to import that. I'm not going to. If we do 100%, the other solution is a copy 100%. And where that's going to wash out is everybody talking about, relevance. And where you still have a disagreement in relevance is where you have a disagreement in equivalence, right?
Exactly. If you have a base layer that wants to support disagreement on equivalence, you can't have curators that decide on it.
Yeah, the question is where, at what, and this is why I'm a bit worried. I waffled back and forth on materializing equivalence classes a lot. And I guess I'm still not done waffling on this, because there's really cost benefits on both sides, and being able to support differences about equivalence is absolutely, for me, a requirement. But then I fear that then there's no equivalence class up to a point, because everything is contested. And then this whole thing about saying, okay, fine, we can use acontextual claims as equivalence class. Well, if there's no equivalence class, I'm not sure where that leads me. But I do like your idea of doing it as a difference of treatment. What I was trying to say with so far uncontested equivalent, so far uncontested terms, building definitions on so far uncontested terms, it also means building it on so far uncontested equivalences. And that means equivalences can be, treated a posteriori, but it means you have to kind of keep the history of everything, which has always been my
well, what do you mean by treating equivalences a posteriori?
It means that something threatening the equivalence a posteriori. You can say these are equivalents until somebody contests it. Then somebody does, and then, okay, well, those were thought to be equivalent, and now maybe not. And we have to revisit the inferences based on that equivalence because the equivalence was contested. So that means you have to remember this term, this claim was made about this version of the term. It was applied by equivalence to this other version. Oh, that equivalence is threatened. So we're not sure anymore.
Even matter, because if they're not equivalent and the supporting and opposing stuff you added, everything you link to it, it will become irrelevant because of the non-equivalence, essentially, or it is relevant and no harm done, right? So I think it doesn't matter.
What I'm saying is it means we're keeping track of, oh, I think this argument made about this equivalent term applies to this one. Oh, maybe not after all. So that means you have every inference is tentative and you have to track the history of every inference.
Yeah, of course, because because your inferences are different. Yeah,
that's the cost. That's the cost.
Yeah, so if you believe it's equivalent and you're looking at whatever version, you will want to see the same inference. But still, you can just, if you believe it's equivalent, isn't it then just a matter of blending all the inferences across the different versions into one view?
That's fine, but what I'm yes, but that means you're not. How should I put it? It's always, whenever you do AI, it's this. the cost of doing all the calculations every time versus the cost of materializing and caching some of the calculations. And there's a space-time benefit, the space-time cost balance. I know I'm speaking optimization, but this is the fundamental problem of AI. I mean, how much do you want to materialize versus how much do you want to recalculate every single time? Both are costly. And
I don't think that's relevant at this point.
I think it's extremely relevant.
It becomes relevant when you talk the process. You know, if you design a perfect system that can't be implemented, there's no point in designing that system.
No, but it's not about not being implemented. I'm just thinking from the user perspective. What does it even mean if you would see all the relevance arguments of all the different inferences bundled together? If you then want to pull them apart again, there's no way of differentiating as a user which one you were looking at before. It becomes a mess. So in essence, I don't think it's possible. I think in a way that either we don't support equivalence in a base layer, and this is indeed a curated thing on a higher level.
But this is why I was like, you know, kind of rip off the Band-Aid and don't keep. I mean, you don't keep the history in the sense of showing the history. You clean up as you go, so that, yeah, because if somebody, if they are the same, if like the curator says, okay, they're the same, I'm putting them together, what have you lost? If there's debate over whether or not they're the same, and you put them together, what you have lost is any sort of arguments about the thing that's not the same. But yes, that should be stated as a clear, separate claim with separate definitions, so there's no ambiguity there. The other thing you've lost is votes, opinions in terms of.
No, that's not true, Timothy. If you say they're the same and you start treating them as everyone starts treating them as the same, that's what you're saying here. So it's impossible to argue of inferences of the different ones. If you want to treat them differently, then you may want to argue, well, this claim supports that one, but not the other one that it's supposedly equivalent to, right? That will happen. You cannot do that, essentially. You can only add a supporting claim to the equivalence clause at that point. So what you lose is exactly that, the inability of, then the only thing you can do at that point is arguing the equivalence. And then what happens if you succeed?
See, think about it this way. There's term A, term B. There's claims made against term A, claims made against term B. You merge A and B. So claims start to be made against the equivalence class merge A and B. If you merge, if you do a hard merge, and it becomes its own thing, C. And then you decide, no, finally, A and B are not the same. So you unmerge them. Now, there were either, if you've forgotten.
Sorry, are you going to go exactly to left?
The how is by the same way as creating a more specific claim, right, from scratch. That's the how.
Folks,
same process.
Venus schedule is more complicated.
That's why I have a hard stop now too. Every Tuesday, actually, I have a hard stop at 1. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We'll have to talk about scheduling again, but
no problem.
Sorry about this. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Apologies.